Okay, so we're picking up here with Meditation 5, the next chapter in our text, the subtitle of which is The Essence of Material Things and More on the Existence of God. So Descartes' going to start out here by asking the question, can we be certain about anything concerning the so-called material world? And what I mean when I say the material world is I mean the physical world. I mean the so-called external world. I mean this reality that we all assume to exist when we're in our normal, naive, everyday sort of attitudes and dispositions, right? So outside of the philosophy classroom, the room that we normally take for granted, right? This is what Descartes is asking about. This is what Descartes wonders. Is it really there? Can we really be certain about it? Descartes will say that in order to answer this question, he'll first have to examine the ideas that he has of material things. So this is interesting. In order to determine if he can be certain about material things, which are not ideas, he first has to examine his ideas thereof. Okay, so pay attention there to the way that he's approaching this issue. He's approaching it specifically in the beginning from a non-material standpoint. So the question here will be, which ideas of material things are distinct? Remember, again, clear and distinct perception is the criterion of truth for Descartes, and which ideas of material things are not distinct or are less distinct. Descartes will begin with the idea of extension. This just means quantity rendered continuous, so we're talking about having physical dimensions, length, breadth, depth, very similar to the idea of something taking up space in geometry. Okay, Descartes says this idea of extension is a distinct idea to me. And he says that I can actually break this idea down into simpler mathematical parts. It seems that I didn't make these simpler parts up because I also have clear and distinct perceptions of these ideas. So the idea here, again, following his usual method, is breaking something up into the smallest indubitable parts that we can come up with. So let's take a look at a couple examples here. Let's say we have the essence of a triangle. The essence of a triangle is something that's fixed. It's something we all agree upon. As you see on the slide, I've written that it is determinate. It's something that doesn't change. It is eternal. And it's also something that we think doesn't rely upon us. It's not just some idea that exists only in our heads. We think that it is mind independent, the triangle, in its perfection. So we don't actually see triangles in and of themselves in nature, in the outside so-called external or material world. We don't see triangles with our vision, but instead we see the essence of triangles in our minds, or I could put it as in the mind's eye, right? It's an intellectual thing. It's a concept, just like when we were talking in our Plato lecture about how mathematical truths are ultimately broken down into the relationships between different concepts, right? I said 2 is just a concept, 3 is just a concept, and so on. The essence of the triangle is also something that is conceptual. It's something that you know purely in your mind. It's not something that you see out there in the world. So these distinct ideas that I find myself able to grasp, for example, the idea of extension, the idea of taking up space, these ideas, insofar as they appear to me as distinct, cannot be nothing. And they may not exist outside of me. They may be only in my head, even though I said that they are mind independent, right? It's still possible to say that this idea might be one that only exists for my mind, right? But it does exist supposedly in other minds as well. But nevertheless, I know that these ideas are not ones that I invented, not ones that I to use Descartes' language, produced on my own. And this is the real reason why we would still insist that the essence of the triangle is not mind-dependent, but is rather mind-independent. And the specific reasons, we've basically gone through this, but the essence of the triangle can't be changed by me. The essence of the triangle doesn't just depend upon my mind. I can have conversations with other people about triangles, and we're in agreement about how to define one, essentially. It also can't be the case that the distinct idea of the triangle that I have, this distinct idea that's mainly intellectual, is something that is derived from my senses. It's not the case that I'm starting, like Aristotle thought, with my senses, and then drawing certain conclusions about the input that my senses give me and then turning that into the definition of the triangle. Instead, it is something else. But let's proceed here to our next slide and look more at the reason why Descartes is going to say that it couldn't be sourced in the senses. Descartes will have a really interesting example here. He'll say that we know that the essence of the triangle also cannot come to us by way of the senses, visual or otherwise, because there are plenty of other mathematical figures that I could never encounter in my senses. So, for example, imagine a 1,000-sided figure. And we don't mean that it would be impossible to exist, but we mean that you wouldn't be able, with your vision, to differentiate a 1,000-sided figure from another figure. In fact, if you saw a 1,000-sided figure, it would probably appear to you to be a circle, depending on how large it was. And, of course, if it was too large, you wouldn't even be able to really perceive it in its entirety in one glance anyway, right? You would have to look around and sort of follow the figure like you were following the Great Wall or some other extremely large object. So you wouldn't even really be able to count how many sides this figure had. Now, let's take a note here, though. Despite the fact that you couldn't encounter this 1,000-sided figure using your senses, you can actually still say plenty of true things about the essence of the 1,000-sided figure. For example, I'm already saying just here in these comments something essential about it. It's a figure that has 1,000 sides. So it seems pretty clear there then that we didn't get this idea from something that we saw out there in the world. And what Descartes is saying is, just as we have this situation for the 1,000-sided figure, the same would go for triangles, circles, squares, and so on. So what he's really working towards here is the idea that pure mathematical concepts, like the idea of the triangle or what have you, are innate. Innate in the same sense that we use the term in Meno. They are something that we're just sort of wired with. They're something that we have. We didn't acquire them from the senses. So Descartes has made a big advancement here. And he's going to add that anything that is true has to be something, so long as it is clearly known, right? So long as it is distinct. It cannot present itself as something that is clearly known or clearly distinct if it isn't truly that thing. So let's come full circle here. Descartes says that even before my doubts, I had held mathematical truths to be the best kind of truths. They were the ones I was the most certain about. They were the ones I was the surest of. And now I see why I thought this. Now I realize why this was the case. It's because I distinctly perceive these mathematical truths. So how can we take this idea here and apply it to the idea of God and the existence of God? Two different things, right? The idea of God and then the actual existence of this God to which the idea supposedly refers. Well, what Descartes is going to say, and this is one of his really innovative moves here, working towards the end of the book, is he's going to say the clear and distinct perception of God is on par with the clear and distinct perception of mathematical truths. And this is because, according to him, it is one of God's essential properties to always exist, just like the triangle has an essential property to have three sides, and so on, right? So this is something that we clearly and distinctly perceive when we have the idea of God. This is something also that you may maybe disagree with personally. This is something you maybe don't think is correct, that you perceive when you perceive God or perceive the infinite. When you have this clear and distinct perception, does it include the idea of necessary existence? Immanuel Kant, the same Kant who wrote the What is Enlightenment essay that we started with in this course, very famously would refute this part of Descartes' argument. He would say that existence is not a predicate, meaning existence isn't a property or an aspect of something. It isn't something that you can just add on to something. So if that's the case, and he has a full argument for that you can email me about or look into yourself using the internet if you're curious about that. If he's right there, then that would be a problem for Descartes' ultimate conclusions in this text. But we'll assume that Descartes was right here and continue following him through the rest of his thought. Descartes' going to say that this account that he just gave of the essence of God involving necessary existence might sound like a sophism. And this is sophism in the same sense of Gorgias the sophist, who Plato railed against and who I talked about a few weeks ago. So realize, of course, that Descartes already realized that other philosophers were going to take issue with this argument. Kant, later in history, would pretty pretty convincingly put the nail in the coffin for this argument, but Descartes wasn't completely in the dark about the issue here. Descartes says somebody might possibly object, and this is exactly the sort of thing that I want you to do in your paper when you include a possible objection. You want to motivate a problem and then tell me why it isn't one. Descartes says somebody may possibly object that if existence and essence are two different things, in other words, if they are distinct, then it could be the case that God doesn't exist. Right? So when you have a clear and distinct perception of God, it is of the idea of God's essence, not a direct perception of God as such, as God himself or herself. And this is why the objection is worth consideration. And I know, of course, that some people do in prayer or mystic meditation or so on, think that they perceive God. But even having this perception isn't necessarily perceiving existence directly, no more so than you can really perceive your own existence directly, even when you carry out the I think, therefore I am argument. This is something that's rational, right? This is something that is an intellectual perception, but are you really perceiving existence itself? It seems like you aren't, right? It seems like there's some sort of disjunction there, that you're making some sort of leap, some sort of rational step from whatever you clearly and distinctly perceive there, and then the conclusion that I am and I necessarily exist whenever I have the thought thereof, right? That's just the really technical way of putting that. So what is Descartes' reply to this possible objection? He says, with God, it's actually the case that we can't separate existence from essence, just like we can't separate from the essence of the triangle the fact that it has 3 angles with a sum of 180 degrees. So this is something that we already kind of saw. The real clincher, the real forceful response here is that Descartes will state that if God lacked existence, then God wouldn't be perfect. But what do we have? Well, we have a clear and distinct perception of God, meaning God's essence, as perfect, right? As nothing other than perfect. And so God can't lack anything, if Descartes is right here, especially existence, right? This would be an obvious lack of perfection. This would be an obvious deficiency. This would be obviously something that took away from the perception of God as perfect. So that's really the real point here. That's the real argument that Descartes will give against this objection, and this objection that would eventually be further refined by Immanuel Kant. So what we want to add here at the end is that for Descartes, God is the only being who is this way. God is the only being whose essence is to exist. Even in the example of the triangle, we have a slightly different situation, right? Because we said that the triangle's essence cannot have subtracted from it the idea that it has 3 angles, not the idea that it exists. In fact, many mathematicians, as I've said in other lectures, are pretty adamant that triangles don't exist at all in nature, that they're only concepts. So God is the only being who has a essence as peculiar and extraordinary as this, right? An essence that involves necessary existence because of God's perfection. So Descartes will also here respond to Anselm's ontological argument, and frequently in longer standard courses for basic philosophical questions, I'll have students read Anselm, and this will maybe make a little more sense to them. But I will go through this pretty quickly and nevertheless pretty exhaustively for you, just to try to fill you in here, despite the fact that you haven't read any of Anselm's writing. So even though it's the case that God's essence includes existence, necessarily includes it, Descartes realizes that just having this thought of God doesn't actually impart or involve or entail necessary existence. And who he's referring to, as I told you, is Anselm. Anselm, who defined God as that than which nothing greater can be conceived. And Anselm thought that the fact that you can have this conception, this definition of God, proved that God necessarily existed, at least in your mind. But the greatest being would be greater if it actually existed and was not just in your mind. You have a typo there where it says what? If it actually existed and was not just in your mind. So we can conclude that God really does exist. This is how Anselm's argument basically works. Now the problem with this argument, and Anselm was aware of it. It had a very famous objection from another priest, actually. Anselm was a priest, and so was this guy Gonilo. And Gonilo said, this argument can't be right, because if I imagine a perfect island, this obviously doesn't mean that that island necessarily exists in the world, right? Even though it wouldn't be the most perfect island imaginable if it didn't actually exist. So this is tricky, right? And the problem here is this actually seems kind of close to what Descartes is getting at. This kind of seems like it would be a problem for Descartes' argument. But Descartes had read Anselm, and Descartes will address Anselm in this text. He says, Anselm really doesn't go far enough. My argument does resemble his, but it's a bit different. And the crucial difference is that I, Descartes, cannot think of God as not existing. And this proves that God's essence or nature is to exist. So that's pretty subtle. It might to you seem like Anselm's argument already entailed that, but Descartes is saying that it didn't. It didn't actually entail this idea that God was unthinkable of as not existing, and that this addition is something that individuates Descartes' argument, which came later in time. So if you cannot think of God as not existing, then this would seem to prove that God's essence necessarily is to exist. So Descartes will give us that quote, I'm not free to think of God without existence, whereas I can think of horses with or without wings. I can think of an island, even a perfect island, without existence. And that's the real crucial part, right? Descartes thinks that all the counterexamples, including the one raised by Gonilo, won't actually be able to treat his version of this argument. So he adds, there's a great difference between having a false assumption and the true idea that is inborn in me, the first and chief of which is the idea of God. So he's saying that this idea of God isn't just some false assumption. It isn't something that people just assume to be the case or presuppose, but rather it is something that we know is true, that we have innate, and that is necessary in order to know other things. But we're not done yet. There are actually a couple other problems that Descartes will choose to respond to in this chapter. And the basic issue here is, how do I know that I, myself, didn't just invent this idea of God? How do I know that it's not, in other words, a self-produced idea? Well, first, I can't think of anything other than God that has the essence to exist. We already kind of went over that one a moment ago. God seems to be the only idea that we have that involves necessary existence as part of his essence. Descartes will add, I also can't think of more than one God of this kind. So that's going to be an interesting thing that really makes this argument one that specifically will apply to monotheism, right? Religions or philosophical systems where you have just one supernatural metaphysical entity, one God. Descartes says, I can't think of more than one God of this kind. So even in a system of religion where you have more than one God, there would have to necessarily be one at the top that is all perfect and all-knowing and all-powerful. 3, Descartes says that once I assert this God exists, it's obvious that God has to have always existed. And again, this comes down to the fact that this assertion is based on a clear and distinct perception of the idea of God. And this God wouldn't have clearly and distinctly appeared to you, right, again, as an idea, not as the face of God or God himself or something, but this God wouldn't clearly and distinctly be perceived in this way as perfect if this God didn't always exist, because then this God would be imperfect if he had came into being at some specific point in time. God has to be eternal, according to this definition. Lastly, Descartes will add, I can't remove from or add to the clear and distinct perception of the idea of God or the infinite. It's fixed, it's definite, it has certain limits that I cannot move around or shift. So this is how Descartes thinks he can be pretty sure that the idea of God is not one that he just made up. So moving on here, Descartes will add that I'm of such a nature that when I have one of these perceptions that's clear and distinct, I can't help but believe that the perception is true. And here's the reason for this. Here's the proof. Once I realized that one of my clear and distinct perceptions was of God, again, the idea of God, and that everything depends on God, because this is the only thing that would have enough formal reality to account for everything else that I experience and encounter in reality. And once I realized, thirdly, that this God is not a deceiver. Why? Because this God is perfect. Then it has to follow from all of these steps that all clear and distinct perceptions are necessarily true, right? This is one of the most important parts of his argument, tying together a lot of different threads that we've seen throughout this text. So is it still possible that I could be dreaming? Yes, it actually is. But Descartes will say, if I am dreaming, when I have a clear and distinct perception in that dream, which is rare, which is perhaps uncommon, but it's not actually impossible, then what happens, even if I'm dreaming, is something is evident to my intellect and therefore is still entirely true. Again, we have a typo there. Entirely is misspelled. But when I have this clear and distinct perception, even in a dream, if it is a clear and distinct perception, then what it means is what I perceive is entirely true. So again, further elaborating on something that we've already seen him suggest, Descartes will say certainty and truth of every science depend exclusively upon the knowledge of the true God. And again, you can switch that out there for the infinite if you wish. Remember, when we began this book, one of his goals was to look for a firm and lasting foundation for scientific knowledge. Well, you can kind of see what that foundation is. It's going to be knowledge of the true God, knowledge of the infinite, again, if we put it rather secularly. But Descartes definitely meant it in a religious sense, more philosophical than theological. But this is going to be how we're able to be sure of our knowledge. And I'm sure you realize that there's probably many scientists today who wouldn't necessarily like this idea that this is the foundation for sure knowledge in the sciences. You'll certainly find many philosophers who find it to be misguided as well. But we'll carry on here. Descartes says, before I was aware of God, I could not have perfect knowledge of anything. Again, we've seen him already say this. We've seen him say that the perception of God is something that kind of makes possible everything else that comes after. And once we have this knowledge, once we have this awareness, then we can have knowledge that's derived from this first foundational perception, including knowledge of material things, the so-called external or physical world. And the reason for this is that the essence of these material things is clear and distinct, right? You may clearly and distinctly perceive the desk. You may clearly and distinctly perceive your shoulder or the person sitting next to you or your coffee and so on. So the reason why you can trust it, the reason why clarity and distinctness are considered to be a good criterion is, again, because of God. So we want to just add here, just to be careful, again, these are clear and distinct perceptions, not necessarily through the senses, but through your mind. And what we mean here is mind in an intellectual or rational sense. This isn't to say that you can't have a sense that is clearly and distinctly perceived by you. Again, I even just a moment ago used the example of the desk or the table or coffee or someone next to you and so on. But really the way that you check this, right, the way that you're able to know that it's clear and distinct is intellectual, it's mental, right? It's not just the case that you touch the desk and solely through your body, solely through your arm, you know that you trust it, but rather it's something that you're doing up between your ears. It's something that's happening in your mind. So this is what he means. And with that, we're at the end of Meditation 5.